The Lore You Know, a show where we chat with some amazing human beings who are storytellers, collectors, and folklorists as we discuss the history of, inspiration behind, and importance of recording and sharing regional tales. I am your host. My name is Heather Moser, and today I am joined by author, paranormal investigator, Bigfoot researcher, and co-founder of West Virginia Cryptids and Strange Encounters, Les Odell. Hi, Les.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm well. I'm super excited to have you on here and for you to be the first person that I interview for this show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very honored.
So the focus of this podcast or show is going to be storytelling and folklore of the area and stuff. So I wanted to ask you first, how did you first encounter storytelling as a child? Like, who was telling you stories?
It basically, my grandma always told stories about different things, and then my dad was a heck of a storyteller. Whether they're ones that he made up, or just for us kids to give, to scare us kids, or just to make us laugh, or just true stories that he's heard through his family being passed down. Yeah, my grandma, she told us all kinds of stuff, and she tells stuff just to scare us kids to death sometimes. I don't remember some of them, but I do know things. She would do things also, like these little tricks she did. She'd done one where she'd take like her hanky or whatever, and it looked like it would go in and out of her ears on both sides. I don't know how she did it, but yeah, she'd do that with us little kids. It scares half to death.
That's awesome. So how did that manifest? Did the storytelling happen like during holidays, just during regular conversation, while you were working? When did you most often hear the stories?
It just everyday life. I mean, there could be something that come up, and my dad was like, "Oh, this happened. I remember this happened." And, he tells a story about something he dealt with, or somebody he knew, had an experience about something. It was just run of the mill everyday stuff. Well, not exactly every day, but there was nothing that actually sparked it. Just in conversation most of the time.
And you've continued this story then or this whole thing as you've gotten older, you've kind of passed that down to your children as well?
Yeah, I tell them stories. They laugh at me because they call them pap jokes sometimes, or pap stories that I share with them. So there's a whole joke with that. But yeah, I tell them things. But the typical, I guess, what do you call it? That dad thing where you just I'm just to mess around with, hey, boogeyman's going to get you. That typical thing. Just to get them riled up and watch them, and then laugh at them when they're riled up about it.
So when it comes to sharing stories and folk tales and stuff, why do you think that it's important to share these tales, to continue these stories, and especially if it's a family story? What is the importance behind continuing that tradition?
So it doesn't get lost. I mean, it's a shame that we've gotten to the point now, to me, in life, where everything has to do with some video game or some something like that, instead of a traditional story, or traditional tale. Just to have that passed down to the next generations, for them to keep. Hopefully they'll pass it on down to their children.
Have you used, of course, you talked about the typical, just to get them riled up or scared or anything, but have you used any tales that you've heard since you were younger to serve as like a warning to your kids?
I mean, I'll tell them stories, but I don't know. I don't. You mean kind of like a cautionary tale in a way?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, like where I grew up, in the town I grew up, there's a tale about a Bigfoot type creature called the Goon, the Granttown Goon. I heard it when I was younger, but then there's other people say it's just a hoax that was made. But I've told the kids, hey, they're out in the woods, the Goon will get you, or whatever, don't run off in the dark, stuff like that.
What was that story?
It almost reminds you of Momo. It was in the 70s, supposedly in the 70s, and there was a hairy creature with the long hair over its face. They talked about the eyes being being like a reddish color, and it was seen near the what they call the coal fields, which is now a power plant. There's a power plant sits there, but it was the old coal mine slate dumps from years ago. And then on the other side of the road was just this huge uh, cornfields, and that's what we called it as kids, was the cornfield, and everybody would go up there and hang out and stuff. But I think it. I don't know if it was really a true story, because there's not much about it, but other than you hear people say, "Hey, don't go near the cornfields or because the coal," because the goon will get you. I think it was maybe one of those stories started where they didn't want kids and people hanging around that area. So,
Hmm. What is one of your favorite stories that you heard from the area you grew up, other than this particular one?
well, it's probably the buttermilk hitchhiker, which is right just you know right up the road from the town I grew up in.
Mm.
So supposedly, I forget the dates and stuff, but there was a peddler years ago would come into Granttown, and this hill, this road that comes down from the top of the mountain, comes down into Granttown. It's all twisty, turny, and they call it the Buttermilk Hill because they said when milk trucks or milk carriers would come off that hill, by the time they got to Granttown, the milk had already turned to buttermilk because it had been sloshed around so much. So, but it went on, and then there was a story where a peddler would come into town, and then after a while, he didn't come, and they were wondering where he was at, and I guess they found his remains later. Where the top of the mountain was, there's a big ravine or a big cliff, and it would go down to the creek, which is right below, right at near Granttown. And I guess they found his remains in a barrel, if I'm remembering the whole story right. But that in turn led to when people would come across the hill on horseback or buggy eventually on certain times of night, and certain the weather was certain, the whole thing like that,
Yeah.
that they would feel something jump on the back of the horse, hold on
Mm.
to him, or onto the buggy, and it would ride to the bottom. This specter would ride to the bottom of the to the hill, with them, and then eventually, as they got to the bottom, when they got to the bottom, it would disappear. Well, then that led into later on in like this 50s, 60s, into the automotive, with automotives or automobiles and stuff. People would say that they would look in their rearview mirror, and there would be this man sitting in the back seat. So they eventually got to call the buttermilk hitchhiker. So that was the one we grew up with.
That's cool. There's lots of versions of that in different areas too. That's really neat. Um, so aside from the storytelling that you had as a child and then you're now passing that on, what are some other ways that you've seen folklore preserved, or that you have personally been preserving folklore over the years?
I try to keep a record of the things I hear talk. People tell me the stories. I try to look into like older accounts. I'll try to dig into areas to see if I can find some older accounts of stories, and preserve those in writing the best I can, or copy them down, or keep them somewhere. Uh,
Mhm.
so that way, and just talk to other people that have stories, and try to share some with them, and hopefully they'll do the same thing I'm doing.
So one book that I know, I'm pretty sure you're a fan of too, is Ruth Ann music, right? These two. Yeah.
Right there. See?
Yeah. uh, well, since you're down in West Virginia, it's probably easier to do this, but well, obviously easier than for me up here in Ohio, but have you gone around to find some of these locations that she talks about?
Well, a lot of those, there's several of them that's from the town I'm in the Grant Town area. If you went through there, you'll see some of the mine stories, the ghost stories from the mines. That's from Grant Town. Uh,
Mhm.
the Coffin Hollow one, that's in Monongah, just right down the road from me. So yeah, that I know where that's at. And there's another one that I'm trying to remember exactly which one it was, but it was in a hollow in Grant Town. So yeah, I knew where that one was at, or somewhat knew where that was at. By going about the stories.
Yeah, I guess I should say for people that aren't actually watching this but listening instead, that we were just talking about holding up the books of Ruth Ann music, The Telltale Lilac Bush and Coffin Hollow. Um, so for her, one thing that I like about her, and I'm wondering if you do this as well when you're recording these stories, is that in the back of her books, she writes down who her informants were.
Yeah.
And are you keeping a note of that, at least for you, even if you don't publicly put that out someday, who
Yeah.
your informants are?
Yeah, the best I can. Yes.
Yeah. Because I've often wondered, and if I mean you're familiar with the area, to go back through some of these informants and try to find these people or relatives of these people and see if that is still a thing. So one thing that we have talked about before, which I think lends itself to the whole idea of preserving something, is the idea of course, not only preserving stories, but preserving the areas where these people lived.
Mhm.
So, for example, you told me once about a cemetery that you helped raise awareness to how poorly it was preserved.
Yeah, that was. I hope I did. I mean, it seemed I did a video and put it out there, and then there was other people that kind of caught on with it, and then eventually, not too long after, they cleaned it up. It's the Fairmont City Cemetery,
Mhm.
and the reason I was at that cemetery is because I was looking into the story about the giants here in Marion County, and it led me to actually look for the doctor that supposed to examine these remains that were found in Reesville.
Mhm.
Well, because I wanted to verify that there wasn't, the actual person by that name and the doctor. So it led me to the genealogy department, the library, and I looked it up or looked him up, found that he was a real person. Uh, said he was in Fairmont City Cemetery, and I actually went to the cemetery and was shocked because you couldn't even see any of the graves. There was so much brush and briars, and I was actually digging through the briars to find. And I searched. I don't know. It was a little while as I crawled around inside bramble bushes to actually find his actual marker or stone. So yeah, he was an actual person. Whether that he had part of that story or not, it depends on some of the literature you find.
Right. And everything was in disrepair at that point.
Yeah, it was pretty rough. Uh, they 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 did clean it up, but they didn't do to me a service to the cemetery and the folks that are there when they did clean up. Because basically they just took a machine and went in with like a brush hog and drove over a lot of stuff, and for the most part. But I haven't been down there since earlier this year, so I don't know what it looks like now. I don't know if they let it go this year or not. But even if they did, it wouldn't be as bad as it was the first time I was there.
Right, right. And you kind of talk when you mentioned going into the genealogy like library and talking with people, like what are some of the steps that you've taken as you're tracking down some of these stories that's more like a boots on the ground type approach? I mean, you start with hearing a story maybe or reading it somewhere, and then from there, what do you do? What are some
I,
resources you use?
as far as the Giants, it's in this book. I don't know if people can't, nobody's going to see it, but you can. It's called Now and Long Ago. It's actual Marion County history book, and it
Okay.
talks about the Giants in Marion County or in Reesville in an area called Palatine and things like that. And it tells the doctors' names and there's other stories and other things in there, but it's a lot of it's just general history. But then when it talks about that, it also talks about the mounds that were there, the Macadam Road,
Mhm.
which I don't know if you know what that is.
No.
Well, let me just give you a little backstory of it. There's a convergence of the the Tiger and the West Fork rivers. It's
Okay.
in Fairmont. Stories from that literature says that from that convergence and that there were mounds from there all the way to what they call the Newport area, but it's called Catawba now. And there was this road that ran from those areas. It was called the Macadam Road, and I guess macadam is a type of is how it's built. I don't know, I guess, but what it is they take rocks and crushed mussel shells and build this road. and this road was 9 feet wide and 14 inches thick. When if the road was there, it's probably not going to be able to be found now, because the dams were built. There were dams built in the early 1900s, so water level has got way up to where it's probably covered them. That road ran all the way down through Reesville, and along that road there were artifacts found, supposedly earthen mounds that were even in the shape of like a profile of a face, which now they're all gone, because the book says that over years they were plowed over, and we're not talking huge mounds like the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville and stuff like that, but they were plowed over. But they talk about how coffee bean bags full of artifacts were taken from these mounds and like shipped away. Along the river in Reesville, an area where they call Palatine, and down near White Day, there were several skeletons found, that were considered giants. The ones at Reesville gets talked about the most, and it says that they were found by a bridge crew that were digging a footer for the bridge that crosses the Paw Paw Creek. And Nimrod Satterfield was kind of like the kind of like a squire, whatever, like a lawyer or judge or whatever. And then he had a doctor come in by Zachuel or Jedi. I can't, but Dr. Kidwell is what his name is. Zedekiah Kidwell supposedly examined them, and they were so fragile that within few hours or whatever, they started to decay or fall apart.
Yeah.
So they said, the doctor or Satterfield said they needed to be reburied. So supposedly they reburied them in what they call the Jolliffe Cemetery. And in the book, it's got Jolliffe Cemetery in parentheses. Okay. Well, after going to the library, the genealogy department of the library, and other stuff, nobody knows where there's the Jolliffe Cemetery in Reesville. So just by whims, I'm just driving around, checking out other places, and by some of the clues, I go to the Prickett's Fort area, which is a pretty well-known fort here. And the family, the Prickett's, were really well known, and they have a cemetery there. And then there's a small stream that runs from the river to that cemetery. So I'm at that cemetery, and then I see Jolliffe stones, just a few. Well, the Prickett's and Jolliffe's married back in whatever. And I think, well, maybe they're there. Maybe this is where they're at, because there's a stream that comes in from the river. It's almost directly across from Reesville. Maybe this is where they're buried. Then I did find a Jolliffe Cemetery, but it's 45 miles away. It's another county. And I'm thinking, well, at that time, in that time period, maybe that's just out of the question, because that'd been a long way to travel. But so I still went to the cemetery. It had there were stones there that were in the right time period, and then everything. But I just didn't feel that they were. That's where these giants could have been, because it's just the way, as far as away as it was. So then I come across. They gave me this at the genealogy department. It is a 1886 maps of the Marion County area.
That's awesome.
So I was reviewing the maps, and I looked, and I come across this one map section that was in the Catawba. It was of Catawba, which is back then was called Newport. And I see, because it's got land names or landowners' names on it, and I see the name on the map. It says J. Jolliffe, and that's the first time I found a land plot that had So I went to that area. There's a few houses there, and there's one house right where the intersection is, where it shows the first part of that land. I pull in, and here's this old feller's. He's outside working, and I walk up and I talk to him, and I ask him. I said, "Hey, this is what I'm doing. Looking for have you ever heard of the giant story?" He said, "No, I've never heard of it." And I said, well, I'm looking for a family cemetery. He said, there's no cemetery on the property. He said, but there is the burial mound. And I'm not even thinking when I'm standing on his back porch, looking at this bank, that it's a mound. And I've got pictures of it. I got aerial, satellite pictures of it. And he said, yeah, he said, family has known for years that this is an Indian burial mound. He said, when I grew up, he said there's a fence around it. We weren't even allowed to have, we were told don't even let the cattle on it, don't play on it, don't do anything.
Right.
So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I talked to him for a few more minutes. And as I was getting ready to leave, he stops me. I'm backing out in the car. He said, hey, wait a minute. He said, by the way, he said, there's no graveyard here, but there's one across the creek over on the bank on the other side of it, over up on the hill. And I was like, okay. So I drove up there, and I'm like all excited to see what I was going to find. And I was disappointed at first because it was all more modern stuff. And I got out, still walked around, and I noticed back in the back, I could see this just huge, like, I don't know what kind of tree it was, but it was a dead stub that was 10 or 12 feet tall and probably three or 4 feet wide, just standing there. And then there was a big huge cedar pine, which, by the size of it, was old. And I'm thinking, and I don't know the background, you may, but in a lot of cemeteries around here, they use cedar. They put big cedars in cemeteries, or put cemeteries where there was big cedars. I don't know why, but they are here. And I was like, well, I'm gonna check it out. And I started walking back. As I get closer, I'm looking at the stones and I'm seeing names and this star name and then all of a sudden I see Jolliffe. I see this first stone says Jolliffe. Then I see wooden planks sticking out of the ground. And I keep walking and I see Jolliffe. And I'm like, holy cow, maybe this is it. And I walk over to that stub, and it's a drop off, goes down to this creek. It's called a little creek. And I look over from that vantage point. The first thing I can see is the mound. I can see the whole mound. And I'm thinking, oh, this has got to be where they're at. So I went back and I started looking into the doctor, and that's how I found him. And I found Nimrod Satterfield, his grave. And then I was like, as I looked into the doctor, I started reading through his bio that's been written, and there's one last paragraph that says he was a member of the MP Church, an upstanding member of the MP Church. And I'm thinking, I've seen that somewhere before. Where have I seen MP Church? So I started reading again. I couldn't find it where I was reading. Then I looked at the map, and right beside the mound, there's the church. And on the 1885 atlas, it says MP Church. So I like, holy cow! You got the mound, you got Jolliffe Cemetery, you got MP Church. And then if you read into a little bit more, it talks about the Macadam Road. And where's the Macadam Road in? In Catawba, right where little creek is. It comes off the river right there. So if those giants of Reesville, if they're, I may be completely off, but there may be a Jolliffe Cemetery there. But for me, everything leads to that cemetery, and because of the mound, the doctor, and things like that. And then I went on a little bit further and started just reading into the area, and you hear about them being found in Palatine. And anybody that's from the Fairmont area knows Palatine is the Palatine Park. There's a little spot in Fairmont they call Palatine. But if you look up to Catawba area, like the church or anything now, that's called the Palatine District. So Catawba is actually called Palatine. So and then I talked to a lady online, and she says she remembers her grandfather talking about giant skeletons being found in Palatine, and that where she lives in Catawba. So the ones that were being talked about in Palatine, I don't think are in the Fairmont City area of Palatine. I think they were actually found in Catawba. And the other ones that were found in White Day are only just like 2 or 3 miles down the road. So I think they're all that that area is key to where they're at, if they did exist.
Yeah, and you wrote this all down, right? Okay, good. That's awesome. So that all started because of the book that you have that you showed us. You starting to get these stories from that. Like, what are some of your other favorite folklore books to head into some of these stories, other than Ruth Ann music and the local book that you showed us?
Um, I don't know if I just some local authors or some
Mhm.
folks that I know, things like that. If I find a little book, let me think, like this one here, I've had this one for years, as you can tell.
Ooh, what is that?
It's by Regina and Ray D. Or I can't.
Ariano? Dariano? I don't know.
Ariana, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's looks like it's Italian. I couldn't speak. I couldn't
Yeah.
pronounce it. But I've had that. My mom got this book for me somewhere. I remember she was, or I was in fifth grade, fourth, fifth grade,
Mhm.
and she got me this. So I've had that a long time. But it tells about the ghost in the mine. Uh, I think it just tells about. It's not just ghost stories, but it has like you know that those little the lamb and the wolf, things like that. It just
Mhm.
folklore stories.
Obviously, local lore is something that is of interest to you, but are there other geographic areas that have piqued your interest as far as their folklore goes?
I just like to hear stories from all over. Basically, I can't say there's one particular area.
Yeah.
I like the superstitions or stories like the Irish and stuff that whether it's the Banshee or whether it's like superstitions like if someone passes away in a house, you cover the mirrors or things like that. I like that stuff.
Yeah. When are you familiar with Patrick Gaynor's book, which is Ghosts and Signs? I should have brought it today so I could hold it up, but it's a red book. It's got a red cover. And so it's divided into three sections: witch lore, ghost lore, and then signs. And the signs are more like, the most recent one that I'm thinking about is, oh, you got it?
Yeah, I forgot my son got it for me for Father's Day. Now that you're talking,
Ah,
I
there
haven't
it
got to read it
is.
yet.
See?
Yeah,
Yeah. All right. So in the last section where he has signs, it has things in it like um the most, I don't know, what pops in my head is the idea of the woolly worm being outside and you look at the color
right,
of the woolly worm. So I was
right,
wondering, when it comes to little signs like that, which still fall in the realm of folklore,
right.
are there anything that you use because you're outside all the time? Are there things that you were taught over time and you just kind of are aware, whether it's weather related or animal related or anything like that?
Yeah, the woolly worm we've always done that. If it's all black, you're gonna have bad winter. If it's the persimmon seeds. If you cut them open, if it's a spoon, you'll have a lot of snow in the winter. If it's a fork, you won't have as much. But if it's a knife, there won't be any at all. If it's just the shape of the seed. Um, what else? If you the amount of times you have fog in November is the amount of days you'll have snow in December. Um, that's one that my grandma used to say all the time. Um, there's a lot of them that I, the general ones. Don't go under a ladder. An open ladder. If a black cat crosses your path, I think it's right to left is good luck, left to right is bad luck. Something like it's one or the other. But we've always been told if a black cat crosses your path anytime, my dad always says it's just bad luck anyway. Things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. So last question.
Hmm.
We're gonna set the scene, okay? We're we're back at the Haymond house, sitting
Okay,
on the porch.
right.
And it's summer, it's nice outside, we're just relaxing. And I just say, Les, tell me a story. What would you tell me?
Like a true life story, folk story. I mean,
Whatever. I'm just there to listen.
I probably would. Most time, I would tell my first personal experience is why I got into paranormal to start with. I mean, later in life, I did. we I was around 7 or 8 years old, and as a kid, we moved quite a bit. My dad was he was let's say he would my grandma, even my grandma moves a bunch. So my grandma said that was gypsy blood, or she had gypsy blood, so they moved. And I mean, we actually sat down one time. My dad and my uncle and my dad sit down. Not me. I'm sorry, but they wanted to remember. Try to write down how many places that they moved during their life, during their childhood. And my oldest son even laughs at me because we'll go someplace to say, well, Nan used to live right here, great Nan used to live right here. But they figured out that they had moved in their childhood between 50 and 60 times. They moved that many times. So as a kid, we moved quite a bit. I moved almost every year. A couple times there was twice a year, as growing up, until I was in sixth grade. So when it was around I think it was second grade, because I was in Monongah Elementary School. So we moved into this house, moved in the middle of the night, because Dad was working, so we'd move after he got home from work. But it was a big farmhouse. I mean, just your typical West Virginia old farmhouse. It just it was a lot of room to roam. You had the yard was not fenced off, but it had a perimeter of pine trees that was across the yard. Had a big sunroom on the front of it. Had couple outbuildings, a huge barn, a big block chicken coop, and an outhouse. We actually used an outhouse. I'm not even, some
Yeah.
people are old enough to use it. Yeah, I used an outhouse. I was 50, but still using an outhouse. But the thing was, I it the house inside, when I was inside, gave me the weirdest feeling from the time we moved in there. And I don't know, I'd walk through the house and it felt like something was going to jump from the rooms, like dark rooms, and grab you. And there was one stairwell went up to this attic part, or it was actually a big room, but I would consider it the attic. And that stairwell just creepy. It's creepy as can be. Well, after a little time there, I well, let me back up. My brother and I shared a bedroom. There was only two of us at the time. There's three of us now. There's two of us at that time. We shared a bedroom, and as some of all the you hear the creepy old stories go, and the bunk beds, the evil bunk beds. We shared bunk beds. So which I think bunk beds might be a portal to hell or something, because you always hear stories about that. But I was on the bottom bunk, and I remember being able to. Let me set the room up. As you walked in the door, the bunk beds would be on the left, and then you had a offset of the room to the right, and we had an old wardrobe that was there that belonged to my grandma. Well, actually, it belonged to her significant other, because my grandpa died before I was born. But I knew I considered him my grandpa, but they never married. But it belonged to him. And then you went, and there was a window on the other side of the room, and we'd go to bed, and I would notice these little shadows coming from the doorway, like going across the walls, going toward the window. And I had no idea what they were. Thinking, 7 or 8 years old, I'm thinking, well, maybe it's just the light from outside. Then, after a couple times, I noticed that there was a large shadow standing in the corner that I could tell what it was, and it had a figure of a person, your typical shadow person you hear now. I hear stories about now, and it's standing there. And I'd take the covers and I'd pull them over my head, and I tried to scream for my dad. I couldn't scream. And people, and you got people now like, oh, it's sleep paralysis. No, I was completely awake. I remember being awake. I remember pulling the covers over, and I'd look out and it would be gone, or I'd fall asleep, you know, basically out of exhaustion, waiting. And then it'd go a little bit and nothing would happen. Then it would happen again. I'd see it again. And it happened in my mind. I remember it happened like 3 or 4 times, seeing this thing stand in the corner. And I tried to scream for my dad, and I couldn't. I just couldn't get it to do anything. Well, the last time I remember seeing it is I instead of just pulling the covers up, I slid up because the bunk beds were against the wall. I slid up into the corner of the headboard and the wall. And when I did, this thing went from looking to in the direction where these other shadows would move to turning its head and looking at me. And then within a split second, it was like 8 to 10 inches from about this far, about that far from my face. It leaned in underneath the bed and was just, I couldn't see any features. There was no eyes, no, things like that. I could just see the shape of the head and the shoulders. And when it leaned in, people, you hear people talk about seeing the shadow figures blacker and black, and it might, it looks like maybe just a blank cutout of something super black. It had that shape of a human, of a person or whatever, but it wasn't steel. The black, it was almost like that shape had super condensed black smoke inside of it, just swirling around. I mean, I still freak out thinking about it, but it was moving. It was moving
Yeah.
inside. It was just like swirling around in all different directions. And it just leaned in, and within a little bit of time, I don't know how long, but to me, it felt like it was forever. It moved back, kind of turned, and I can't say it walked away because I couldn't see anything walking, but it went out and it used the door. It went through the door and turned left and went toward our living room. My mom and dad's bedroom was right on the other side of mine, and it went down toward our bedroom. And that was the last time I seen it because we moved not too long after that. We eventually moved, and but that's been 40 years ago,
Mhm.
and I still probably once or twice a year I'll have a recurring nightmare that something I'm in that house,
Mhm.
something's chasing me through the house, and I'll wake up and kind of screaming, and sometimes wake myself up with doing that, or I'll wake up and even be crying and like, and then I'll eventually go back to sleep, and then it starts right over. It doesn't start like the beginning. It starts where I stopped. It starts over. So I thought all my life, I think, I've really, really told anybody about that. I kept that story and I never told anybody. So one day I decided to write. I wrote it down because there was a radio show wanting to have, for you to send stories in. So I wrote it down and I sent it in. That was the first one they read online. And so I let my dad hear it. And I said, "You know where that was at?" And he said, "I absolutely do." He said, "That was in Four States and at Michael's Hill." I was like, "How do you know?" He wouldn't tell me. So he had to have experienced something in the house as well, because he knew exactly where the story was at.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, that would probably be the one I started out with most of the time.
I like that. Have you gone back to that house?
It's gone. I've been back. I've been to where it was at, but it's been torn down. The whole farm's gone.
Oh man, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a good one to start with, I think. And a good reason to get into all of this
Yeah,
weirdness.
it's the
Um,
reason why.
yeah. So you just came out with this.
Yes.
Yeah. And I have a copy. I was excited to tell Seth that I have one, but he said he has one too. It's I'm like Les signed it for me. He said he already has one, so I couldn't hold that over him. But
Uh-oh.
anyway, yeah. So West Virginia Cryptids, a visual field guide for traversing the mountain state that you wrote, and Mark A. Randall did the illustrations for. So I encourage anybody to pick that up. Where can we find and follow you and share stories with you?
My Facebook. You can, yeah, you can reach out to me personally or on West Virginia Cryptids and Strange Encounters, which is WV. And don't spell it the whole West Virginia. It's WV Cryptids and Strange Encounters. You can send me an email at West Virginia Case 304 at yahoo.com. If you're interested in the book, you can find it on Amazon. because I actually don't have any right now. I've sold them all out, but you can find them on Amazon. And I'm pretty sure Mark is sold out too. So
Hey man, that's a good problem to have. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today.
thank you for having me.
Yeah, so excited. So for our listeners, please continue to follow Small Town Monsters, like, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, become a channel member for more behind the scenes fun, early access to some of our shows like Beyond the Trail in 4K, and also the ability to watch as much Small Town Monsters as you want without commercials, because that's always the best. And if there's anybody that you want to hear talk about the lore that we should know, please feel free to email me at heather@smalltownmonsters.com or leave a comment below. So until next time.